Thank you very much. I guess I have to doubly thank the organizers. The organizers for inviting me. That's the first such I've, um, so I really appreciate it. Second, this is the first time I've ever been awakened in the morning by an organizer, and I won't go through all the long that happened. Thank you for taking the first spot. I'd like to talk about work that's been going on in my about a decade on particles. These are parallel methods for immersed boundary simulation of particles in viscoelastic. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention my colleague Gianluca Giacchino. We've been involved in developing these codes. Um, the reason being that we spent so much time doing this, in case you're not aware, is that suspensions of particles in fluids that are complex, particularly viscoelastic, are everywhere, including additive manufacturing. Fracking fluids are most often plastic pastes, and in the body, cilia beat mucus and bacteria move in mucus. Sperm swim in cervical mucus. One of the most recent applications that we're looking at is the addition of platelet particles up in the upper right, synovial fluid act as a treatment for arthritic in mice right now, but they'll eventually be even in the addition of cells and vesicles to microfluidic devices, there's a little trick. If you add a little polymer, you get less rupture of the cells, vesicles, and nobody knows why, but that's a little trick that many microfluidic technology. So the question is, why isn't there a big science of particles in viscoelastic fluids? And the short answer is, until the last 5 years, there haven't been codes that are able to get particle level resolution for enough particles that you can actually say that it's a suspension. Whereas the field of particles in Newtonian fluids is actually quite vast and well developed. When you turn to particles in viscoelastic fluids, there are anecdotal studies. Certain studies point the way, but no general science. But now there are such codes. Not only the code I'm going to show you today, but there are codes by Luca Brandt and Marco Eliero here. And I'm going to talk about the useful and what the challenges are in developing codes that can actually get particle resolution with a viscoelastic fluid. So the codes, and I talk about this actually in a perspective paper that I was asked to write in the AICH journal on the fact that I believe this area is going to burgeon next decade, where there'll be many players jump in, try to understand these suspensions. One of the reasons that this is important is because these suspensions often act qualitatively different than their Newtonian fluid counterparts. I'm going to talk about that today. So anyway, what I'm going to start with is developing this computational tool that can resolve the flow with moving particles suspended in viscoelastic fluids and in complex geometry. In order to accomplish this, it's going to be massively parallel. We're going to have a finite volume approach in the fluid. In the particles, when we do deformable particles, it'll be finite element. So it'll be a combination finite volume, finite element approach. And the whole point is to get particle resolved simulation. If any of you know something about that, the resolution depends on the elasticity in the fluid. There are regions of very high polymer stretch that occur between the particles and around the particles. And those are actually harder to resolve than the flow field itself. So because they are driven by velocity gradient. And so that's the trick. You need to do many particles with enough resolution to resolve viscoelastic to get physics quality. And then I'm going to use our code to actually gain insight into physical processes that I claim it would be difficult to do if you didn't have such a code. And this also points out why the field is now poised ahead. So I'll talk about our algorithm is going to be an immersed boundary algorithm. So many of you only have particles. I only have grids. So all my particles are grids, and the grids along the fixed Eulerian boundary. And then I'll talk a little bit about what it takes to parallelize and how we get good scaling with that code. I'll spare you all the verification we did over the last 10 years, but I'll talk about 3 different problems that show the different physics in viscoelastic fluids. Prop and support in fracking fluids, which is generally a sedimentation issue, sand sedimenting in a viscoelastic fluid, and how under flow you get enhanced support of the prop, and essentially means you have reduced sedimentation velocity. I'll then talk about what it takes just to get the viscosity of, or the rheology, normal stresses of a suspension in a viscoelastic fluid. And then finally, the most exotic examples are in your body, and I'll talk specifically about swimming. Active matter is a very big deal, nowadays. And I'll talk about the swimming of C. elegans, a worm in elastic fluid, and what it takes to actually simulate that swim. So most of you, I'm sure you understand the immersed boundary method. It's shown here. You have red Lagrangian grids and a green fixed grid. Our grids are all unstructured, unstructured or hexahedrons. You simulate the flows on the grids that do not conform to the shape of the boundary. It simplifies mesh generation. No remeshing as part of. And if you're clever about it, you get particle scale resolution. In fact, our Eulerian grids are coupled to our Lagrangian grids. That is, in some sense, mesh or find the grid based on the presence of particles for reasons that I'll show. The resolution around these particles is critical to getting the so-called viscoelastic boundary layers. And I possibly don't need to tell you that some of the competing schemes are remeshing. So when you move the particles, of course, the original body fit mesh now is not body fitted, and then you remesh. It turns out that for more than about 10 particles, these schemes are completely impractical, meaning you spend all your time remeshing. That's because the green mesh is actually critical. Its resolution is critical to understanding the whole physics. So the remeshing process here is complex, and you can't, I claim, do a full simulation of a suspension. A suspension for this talk will be about 50 or more particles. You need to get about 100 particles to actually get average ensemble average behavior. For example, for the shear viscosity, we've done a few thousand code with resolution. So our study, again, is an immersed boundary study now with unstructured grid. There are relatively limited available codes for viscoelastic unstructured grids. There are now a few on unstructured grids. As I mentioned, the grids will space filling but not necessarily structured. And so we have code. Let me tell you a little bit, for those of you who aren't familiar with viscoelasticity and rheology, the kinds of solutions, elastic, I'm going to talk about. And these are going to be high molecular weight polymers put in low molecular weight or Newtonian solvents. The elasticity comes from the deformation of the molecule. These are relative make in the laboratory, and so I'm going to show you results of the experiment. In a small molecule fluid, as you all know, if you spin the top plate and there's a small molecule between, you measure one material parameter, which is shear viscosity, that defines the state of stress in the fluid. If now you have something like this, a high molecular weight polymer in that solution, and you do the same experiment, then what happens is the particle forms, and it's under tension because Brownian motion is tending to drive it back to the coil. And so the state of stress now in the same experiment is not defined solely by the shear viscosity, but the polymers stretch around top spinner, and they squeeze in stress pressure inside the gap. So there are called normal stresses, which scale approximately like shear rate squared, and there's another material parameter called primary normal stress coefficient. And the presence of these normal stresses actually indicates elasticity of the fluid. The simplest model for that molecular deformation is the so-called dumbbell model. I spent a significant fraction of my career proving it's not a good model. Not a good model. but it's usually where we all start. It's good enough to get qualitative information. There are a number of bells and whistles. Then you hang off the dumbbell model. It's good enough to measure and fit shear capacity data for the fluids. I'll show that as so. Everything today will be dumbbell calculations, but then with rigid or deformable particles within the. Okay, in order to solve such a problem, then you have to solve conservation of momentum for an incompressible fluid. All the Reynolds numbers will be small today, as most of the viscosities are very high, so the inertial effects are negligible. And in conservation of momentum, as you see there, there is an extra term, so-called polymer stress term, sigma I. Sigma IJP is then related to the configuration tensor or an order parameter associated with those molecules. And then within the dumbbell model, you solve the equation here for the configuration tensor. Gamma IJ is the dyad QI of the end-to-end dumbbell. These equations are almost always approximated as hyperbolic. The Schmidt numbers for these, for polymers, is 10 to the 6th. So before diffusion ever comes into the problem, other nonlinearities come in. And so you get shock-like structures. Reason for the resolution surrounding the particles is important. You get shock-like structures that are actually cut off, if you will, by whatever nonlinearity you're going to add to the dumbbell. The two common nonlinearities are defined by the so-called Feeney-P model or the Viscoelastic model. Feeney-P model has a maximum extensibility on that dumbbell, so the spring stiffens as you stretch it. And the Viscoelastic model changes the mobility of the dumbbell, the ability to stretch it, based on surrounding molecules like stretch. Either of those will actually kill off singularity that occurs if you continue to approximate the dumbbell as a linear dumbbell. That's so-called. And there are singularities in the Oldroyd B model, and the so-called high Weisenberg number problem is all centered around that. In standard flow fields, for example, flow past the sphere, there is a singularity and cannot continue calculation, surge calculation past the Weisenberg number of about a half. Whereas with the Feeney-P and the model, can and we have to be careful when we do these calculations that we're actually not calculating a singular. As a result, there are the dimensionless parameters up in the upper right-hand corner that are the important ones. The so-called Weisenberg number, which is a relaxation time times the shear rate. And that's the primary parameter. It measures the rate of polymer stretch relative to the flow. So the higher the Weisenberg number, the more the polymers are stretched, the higher the elasticity. There's a concentration parameter, usually represented by beta. Beta is 0 if there is no solvent, and beta is 1 if it's all solvent. And it's a parameter that basically is a ratio of the shear stress of the polymers versus solvent. As you see there, those are coefficients sitting out in front of the partitioning of the polymer stress. And then, depending on, again, how many bells and whistles you want to hang off the dumbbell, there are parameters associated with that. Finite extensibility parameter and the mobility parameter. These are the parameters I'll refer back to. So within the immersed boundary framework, you have a Lagrangian region or a particle region. You solve the governing equations over the entire Eulerian grid, including the particle region. You then put a force density or a constraint force, if you will, in the regions that are associated with the Lagrangian grid. Those for rigid particles constrain rigidity. You put that in there and calculate essentially conservation angular and center of mass near momentum for the particle. Add the forces that impose that, and then go back and calculate the fluid flow again, and you do that converge. So just pictorially, the way the code works, you project the velocity to the particle mesh. You then estimate linear and angular velocity. You then estimate the rigidity force, project the rigidity force back to the domain. You correct the velocity in the domain. Do this to convergence, and then you move the particle. There are some subtleties to this for viscoelastic flow that I need to go into. So let me talk about that. We used already available massively parallel unstructured Newtonian solver and essentially rewrote it for elastic fluids over the last. So you add the polymer stresses because gamma ij is symmetric and positive definite. You add 6 coupled scalars at a minimum. If you want to add other modes to your polymer model, every time you add a mode, it's 6 more variables that you have to solve simultaneously, velocity and pressure. You then must maintain positive definiteness, and there are a number of tricks to do that. We actually don't solve for the configuration tensor, we solve for the log of the configuration. You set the polymer stretch 0 inside the particle regions as a constraint for rigid particles. For flexible particles, you don't do that, but for rigid particles, it turns out if there's residual polymer stress, it becomes a problem. And the other little trick that you use is these shocks or high regions of velocity gradient occur primarily near the surfaces of the particle. So if you are calculating polymer stretch and you're using a calculation of the velocity gradient, you better use surface points to calculate those gradients. Otherwise, you'll make quite a bit of error. So for example, here's the only verification I'll show you. The left is shear flow path. Thankfully, in my group, we have many body-fitted codes that we compare our immersed boundary code to. So this is a converged body-fitted code simulation for shear flow past the cylinder at a Weissenberg number of 1 for a certain partition coefficient and a certain mobility parameter, fluid alpha 2. If you use IB without correction, that is to say, if just standard techniques to calculate the velocity gradient near the surface, you underestimate the stresses near the surface. But if you use the gradient correction, that is gradient using near surface points for the velocity correction, you get back strength gradient. And you see that it's resolving stress gradient near the particle that is actually get particle resolution. Why do you work this hard? You work this hard to get good scaling. So this is sedimentation of billion tetrahedrons in this case. To speed up the number of processors for our code is linear, nearly linear. It's not ideal, but it's linear. So we've gone up to thousands of processors near linear scaling. More importantly, if we increase the particle concentration, scaling as well, because of course you're not adding particles, adding more grids, you're adding. So therefore you get nearly linear scaling, and this is why this, so that you can do more than 10 particles. I should say that there's a question about partitioning in the parallelism. You have now put a fixed partition down in the Eulerian grid, the particles move along the Eulerian grid, and now you have the question silver and the gold particle process live in. We actually do what's called dynamic partition. So we actually let the fraction of silver particle live in the processor, is the processor on the Eulerian grid, and the fraction that lives in the red calculated by the red processor. And so we repartition at every time. This works very well and is most efficient unless you happen to have all your particles partitioned get balanced. Okay. So let me now go to a couple of problems that I claim it would be difficult to figure out the physics of if you didn't have code. The first one is prop and support under shear. This is another way of saying that is sedimentation or orthogonal shear. And whether you know it or not, when you have a fracking process, as you see here, which now it's horizontal drilling over many kilometers, then you first usually inject slick water, but there's usually a second injection with a fluid that is far more complex that's supposed to support the proppant. The proppant is typically sand, but they even have ceramic particles now. And the reason that that fluid is there is to support the proppant, meaning to prevent the particles from sedimenting before they reach mushroom-shaped kind of crack. And then, of course, you take the pressure off the well, the proppant is in the crack. and it forces the crack open, and then natural gas flows. The issue with this question is there's lots of money made on selling fracking fluid, and it's selling those elastic fluids that's worth the profit. They're usually guar gum of some level of frosting, and it's pretty easy to make a bad proppant. So a bad proppant fluid would be one where the sedimentation velocity actually of the sand actually increases with shear. So the more you flow it, the faster the particle sediment. That's not what you want. What you want is the one on the right-hand side where the settling velocity goes down with good proppant. The problem is these are usually made in an Edisonian fashion. That is, they're related to drilling mud. So the original people that came to Halliburton asked why is it good and why is it bad, and can we engineer fracking? And so that was one of the first questions we started looking. All right, so instead of working with air fluids right away, we did what I'll call the simplest experiment in the world, and that's up there. It's a Taylor-Coët cell. It's one cylinder rotating, the outer cylinder counter-rotating, and then we drop a number of ball bearings. There's a ball bearing, an aluminum or a titanium ball bearing, in a fluid which mirrored the properties of the fracking fluid. So this is one of these elastic fluids. It's polyacrylamide and corn syrup glycerin. The shear viscosity, as you see, is approximately constant. Shear thins modestly, but it has these ends, capital ends. Those are those large normal stresses. And so it is highly elastic, and the black lines here are the fit of one of those dumbbell models, the Feeney model. So we take the ball bearings and we fall it in those fluids, and then we apply different levels of shear and measure the sedimentation velocity for different bearings and find out indeed whether the sedimentation goes up or goes down with shear. And here are the results. This is dimensionless sedimentation velocity for different ball bearings, aluminum on the left, titanium on the right, at different levels of shear or Weisenberg number. Weisenberg numbers increasing up to 10. The open symbols are the experiments I just showed. The closed symbols are our numerical simulations of a single sphere falling with the IB. And we did it for different so-called blocking ratios. So epsilon is the ratio of the diameter of the sphere to the gap. And remember, in the fracking process, that ratio is not small or large, but order 1. So we did it for different size balls, 0.1 rate. And what you see is the sedimentation velocity kind of dramatically dropped as the shear rate increased. In fact, for the titanium sphere, you're seeing a drop of about a factor of 3. And since it's mirrored in our simulations, the question is why? Go now back to our simulation and figure out why. And the short answer is that spheres develop wings. Those are wings of polymer stretch. So what I've colored here are regions of about 20%, 25% polymer stretch above the background. When you have no shear, which is on the left-hand side, and high shear, which is on the right-hand side, sphere, by the way, is sedimenting from right to left. No shear, you have a wake that essentially polymer stretch that extends right behind the sphere. As you apply the shear, which is now in the board, that wake splits, ultimately forming that split structure over on the right-hand side with wings. So that means that the particle has to drag its wings down as it sediments, and that turns out to drag quite enormous, and that is why it's down. Now, they're not really wings in the real sense because the lift here, symmetry, is actually 0. They're more like air brakes. Look down, the heart might look down, the heart of it's quite a large structure. So that's a structure you have to resolve if you're now going to do many particles. So one of the reasons to do single particle calculus is to figure out what kind of grids you get resonant. At these are the operating conditions. Weisenberg. And just to give you some more physics, because they have the wings, the flow has to go around the wings, regions of high tension. As a result, the pressure in the front of the sphere gets large to push the fluid around the wings, and the form drag goes up. So the culprit here is extra pressure drag or form drag that's associated with the fact that there are these structures that are hanging off the particle. So I claim it would be actually quite hard to figure that out if you didn't have a code that could do this. And now we're in a situation where we can understand, presumably, how these things operate at finite concentration. And at finite concentration, it's more complicated. It turns out there's experimental evidence that these things work better if they're higher concentrated, meaning the per particle reduction of sedimentation velocity is larger. That's a plot of the drag coefficient versus Weisenberg number over there for the experiments, which are done at about 20% particle loading, versus the red, which are single simulation. So you get a reduction that's higher at finite concentration, and the question is why? The original code was sold, of course, on multi-particle, so I presumably can simulate that. Here are particles sedimenting at finite concentration. This is 5%. Same kind of fluid. This is with no shear. I've colored the particles green, fluorescent. These are streak images of the particles. And under quiescent conditions, what you actually see is an enhancement of velocity in viscoelastic. They form streamers. These streamer structures are actually very strong. You see them. And these have been seen in the literature before. You'd never get homogeneous settling under quiescent conditions in viscoelastic fluids. They're unstable to concentration fluctuation. So that's the first thing if you're a simulation person and you want to do a multi-particle simulation when you try to understand. So here is our multi-particle code now. This is approximately 60 particles. We've done 100 particles. The left is the Newtonian, and the middle two are different levels of viscoelasticity or different Weisenberg numbers, here measured in terms of the sedimentation velocity of the sphere. So it's 0.27 and 1. What you're seeing is the formation of the streamers in the viscoelastic case, and no such streamers form in the Newtonian case. And so this is a first test whether you can predict collective effects using your bound. And you see the streamers grow and grow in the viscoelastic case. So we indeed were able to simulate the steady static formation of streamers in the viscoelastic suspension case. And the physics for this is actually quite simple. If you have a particle sedimenting in a shear flow, then the relative velocity on the left-hand side of the particle is higher than on the right-hand side. You get higher polymer stretch on the left-hand side, and it tends to push the particle from left to right. And in a mean field sense, that's exactly what's happening with a concentration fluctuation in sedimentation. You get a mean shear which drives particles into the more concentrated region. Okay, but that's not all we're interested in now. This is the suspension now under shear. The top is without shear, the bottom is with shear, and suddenly the enhanced sedimentation velocity completely goes away. What you see on the bottom is it's hard to actually tell the particles are actually sedimenting in the bottom. The sedimentation velocity has reduced by easily a factor of 2 or 3 over the top. And that's why is that? Well, again, we go back to our code, and we calculate now. Let's see. The left is the static case, no shear. The right is with shear now. And the formation of the streamers is essentially halted by the presence of shear. You get these structures break up. You see these wing-like structures that are forming because of the shear, and the dynamics is completely different. So we were able to simulate essentially the loss of streamer formation under applied shear and the resulting reduction of the sedimentation velocity. And in our code, we can actually do the full geometry. So this is actually a Taylor-Couette cell, 1% concentration on the left and 5% concentration on the right. You'll notice at 1% concentration, the wakes structure is not split. These are low enough shear rates that you don't get wake splitting. But on the right, it is split. And it turns out that particle interactions split the wake. So the wake doesn't just split because of shear, but it can also split because a particle following another particle splits the wake and therefore increases the form drag and therefore increases the drag. And that's the primary particle interaction effect in these systems. And again, I claim it would probably be pretty hard to figure that out. And so if you plot the drag coefficient versus volume fraction, the open symbols are our calculations, and you get a much larger increase than you do in Newtonian, again, because of wake splitting. in the viscoelastic. The last two examples I'm going to do are shorter, but they're no less important. Suppose you ask a much simpler question than the previous one. Suppose you just ask, if I add particles to pastes, for example, how would the viscosity increase with particles versus without the particles? So again, it's easy to make one of these elastic fluids. This is polyisobutylene in polybutene. It's highly elastic because you get these large N1s or normal stresses. It also has a particular relaxation time, so if you shut the plates off, it takes a while for either the viscosity or the normal stresses to relax as all those little particles, all the little polymers relax. And so you get a relaxation time in this fluid of about 3 seconds, and that's the definition of elasticity. So what do? We add particles to this fluid. And in this case, we're going to add spherical particles, polyethylene particles in the 32 to 38 micron range in diameter. And what happens immediately is a qualitative change. So the lowest curve here is no particles, and the higher curves are increasing concentration. And the viscosity as a function of shear rate. The fluid itself actually modestly shear thins, as you see. As soon as you add particles, you get shear thickening, meaning the viscosity increases with shear rate. So you automatically get a qualitatively different effect with the particles. And so the question is, why? This isn't just in our laboratory. This has been measured in many laboratories, and there's been no firm physical foundation put on how you get thickening with particles. And so that's right up our alley. In terms of the simulation, the only thing you have to know to understand the simulation is there are actually two effects to the effective rheology. There's the particle stress, which is the stress associated with the particles because it's different with the fluid. And then there's also what the particles do to the fluid. So in this case, the particles interact with the surrounding polymers to create stretch that actually gives you an average effect, and that's called the particle-induced fluid stress. So one of the two of those is going to dominate. Now, the right-hand one is present in Newtonian fluids. The left-hand one is not present in Newtonian fluids, and that's because the fluid that I'm talking about is nonlinear, so you get an average effect of the particles on the fluid in that case. So here are our simulations. We go from left to right, the one particle, and now this is at a concentration of about 10%. You can do about 50 to 100 particles and get good converged effects for the rheology of these particles. The gray now is the growth of those polymer stretch regions surrounding the particle just in the presence of shear now. And it turns out that those are dominant. That is to say, the polymer-induced fluid stress is what dominates the rheological response. And in fact, here is the the contribution of the viscosity at different particle loadings from the particles. And the dilute, one particle calculation is at the bottom, and as we increase, we go up to 10%. And you see the thickening that occurs. I've plotted the particle contribution of the viscosity as a function of shear stress to show that. So there's a plateau, which is a Newtonian contribution, and then there's a thickening part. If you subtract the Newtonian contribution, then the thickening part, which is the part that we're most interested in, is shown over there. And you see that on a per particle basis, that is to say, as you divide out the volume fraction, they collapse. And so the simulations tell you that basically it's a per particle calculation even at 10%. And so now you can go in and figure out what's happening. This is a picture of a single particle calculation for shear flow past a sphere in this case. And the red regions are regions where the polymers are stretched. And so essentially there's a region of closed streamlines surrounding each particle. The polymers float around in that region of closed streamlines and stretch in those regions, primarily because the regions are extensional in character near the particles, and that extra extensional flow then stretches the polymers and creates large additions to the polymer, to the extra stress in the suspension. And that's shown here in the little cartoon where I'm following a polymer as it goes around and around and showing that its stretch, CKK, increases, decreases, increases in Lagrangian time as it goes around. And that's the primary culprit in the thickening of particle suspensions in polymer cases. Now, how do we do relative to the experiments?
The experiments are on the left-hand side. I subtract the Newtonian plateau, and I plot just the thickening part per particle, and the x's are a simulation. So we're below. We're predicting the right trend, but we're below. And at this point, I invoke the model was bad to begin with. That's a great thing to have in your pocket. So we're busy right now actually doing multi-mode models and better models for the polymer because we think it's the per particle stress that we're under predicting, and that's why we don't get quantitative agreement yet with our experiment. Okay, the final one is the most exotic one. As I mentioned at the beginning, many things swim in viscoelastic fluids, cilia beat in mucus, which is highly elastic, and there are many micro robots now that are designed to go into your body and swim in elastic fluids. And so this brings up yet another level of complexity in these simulations. The Drosophila fly in this field is shown here. This is the C. elegans worm. It's about a couple of millimeter length a worm, and you see it swims with this characteristic gait. And it turns out if you put it in an elastic fluid, the gait stays the same, but the swim velocity changes rather significantly. So the original data, good data on this was taken in 2011 in a series of polymer solutions where very accurate centroid positions and shapes for the worm were given by Aratia and coworkers, and so we set about to simulate that using our code. And this is the great thing about the immersed boundary code, because now you can, because everything is constraint forces in some sense, you can now import in your favorite particle stress solver. In this case, we use a finite element particle stress solver to recalculate now the constraint forces, little f, which is the difference between whatever stress law you're going to do inside the solvent. The divergence of the stress law in the solvent are in the particle minus the divergence of the fluid stress law. You can also add active forces. In this case, the worm applies active forces. And then you can go back and use your immersed boundary technique. I'm going to assume the worm is essentially a Hookean solid in these calculations. And then I'm going to apply active forces to make it swim. There's at least two ways to do this. You can imagine that you know what the muscles of the worm are doing, and so you can specify a force. What we actually do is take the shapes of the worm and use that as a reference configuration. So we basically calculate the forces necessary for the worm to reproduce exactly the gait that comes from Aratia's experiments. And so we can get basically, there's the worm, and here's the worm in the computer. And the claim is that that's a pretty good reproduction of the gait. And so we can reproduce the gait within a few percent, and then put it in our elastic fluid and let it go and see why the worm swims at a different velocity in an elastic fluid. Again, we reproduce the experiment exactly. It's in a Petri dish, so there's a wall at the top and a wall at the bottom. We use a Hookean solid model and finite elements to calculate the stress within the worm, given that the reference configuration changes at every time step. The important parameter now is Deborah number, lambda times the frequency of the worm beat, which is the equivalent of the Weisenberg number in the previous examples. Here's the worm swimming. That's the center of mass location from the upper right-hand corner down to the lower corner. And you can then get a normalized average speed and relate it to the Newtonian speed, and that's shown over here, and you get a speed reduction. So you almost always get a speed reduction for undulatory swimmers. And now, again, we can go into the simulation and figure out why. The higher the concentration of polymer, the larger the speed reduction. So that's the different colors here. As you're going down, you're getting higher polymer concentration. The beta parameter is decreasing. And it's almost linear in polymer concentration, which is the plot on the right-hand side. So here's the data. The blue is Shen's data. The curves are our simulations. Now, Shen unfortunately did his experiments at different polymer concentrations, which he didn't measure. So therefore, the best we can do is say that we can get at least the full spread of the data, and the data, as the Deborah number is increasing, is actually at higher concentrations. So we're happy that we almost get the plateau at highest concentration. We're seeing the right amount of speed decrease in these fully three-dimensional simulations. People have tried to do this in 2D. If you do it in 2D, which is simpler, you dramatically overpredict the amount of speed reduction for reasons that we can now figure out. And here are the reasons. The primary thing that's slowing the worm down is its head and tail. It creates polymer stretch with its head and tail. Its body gets out of the way of the stretch, but its head and tail cannot. So there are regions of extensional flow near the head and tail, and those create force, which opposes the motion, and slow the worm down. And that's the sum total of it. And this turns out to be the sum total of what happens for swimming organisms. Here's another organism, an amoeba. This is amoeboid motion, and we can reproduce that. This is reproduced by specifying active forces. A number of bacteria swim this way. If you put this in a viscoelastic fluid, then the amoeba cannot get out of the way of its polymer stretch. So up there is the polymer stretch contours around the amoeba. As it's swimming, in this case from right to left, it swims through a sea of its own polymer stretch, and therefore the reduction that you get in the velocity is actually far larger than undulatory swimmers. And this is something you can learn by doing these simulations. Okay, let me finish there. We've developed this tool, unstructured immersed boundary viscoelastic tool, to calculate either deformable or rigid particle suspensions in viscoelastic fluids. And then we've looked at a number of different problems: sedimentation, particular sedimentation in cross shear as it's related to the fracking issue, the reduction of sedimentation velocity with elasticity, and figured out why essentially the velocities decrease. For single particles, they decrease because of the wings, the structures that form around the particle created by polymer stretch. For a finite particle concentration, those wings are created by particle interactions, and again you get an increase in the form drag and a reduction of the sedimentation velocity. If you just are interested in the viscosity, most particle suspensions in viscoelastic fluids thicken. They thicken because the velocity field now is not just a shear flow, but it has extensional character near each particle, which creates added polymer stretch, and that added polymer stretch increases the effective viscosity of the suspension. Interestingly, through our calculations, up to 10%, this seems to be a per particle calculation. So you can do a dilute calculation and figure these things out just by adding the number of particles. Whether that's true or not at all concentrations, it must fail at some point. We're busy trying to figure out when. And finally, in the biological applications, you're usually interested in active matter. We showed that for undulatory and amoeboid swimmers, you get a reduction in swim velocity, essentially because the motion creates polymer stretch that the objects can't swim through. In the undulatory motion, it's the head and the tail. In the amoeboid, it creates a polymer stretch C that the amoeboid can't avoid, and therefore you get a large reduction. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry for being late. These are the people that did the heavy lifting. That's my group at Stanford. And the people in the circle, Srinath, Krishnan, Will Murch, Mung Fei, Chris, and Jeremy, did all the computations that you saw today. We're supported by the National Science Foundation. The Stanford Energy Alliance supports us for the fracking work, and the Army High Performance Computing Center at Stanford provides DoD machines with which those calculations were. Thank you very much for your